Well, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you all, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation as part of the Karsh Institute of Democracy's Congress, a Cornerstone of Democracy series. This is the fourth conversation in the series, and it's wonderful to see so many of you back again, including our youngest audience members. And our goal is to hear from those across the ideological spectrum who lead America's institutions. While there will be significant policy differences among them, is it possible for us to find a way to strengthen the institutions that are necessary for self-governance? The US Constitution designates Congress as the first among equals, underscoring its significance in the democratic framework. By design, it is intended to facilitate debate, compromise, and consensus building, and embodies the principles of representative democracy. Its bicameral structure was designed to balance the interests of both the populous and less populous states, ensuring equitable representation. Imagined as a great deliberative body and a bulwark preventing concentrated power, Congress has a critical role safeguarding our individual liberties. Congress also plays a pivotal role addressing the needs of Americans, entrusted with creating the laws, allocating federal funds, and overseeing the executive branch. Congress directly influences every aspect of our daily lives, including healthcare, education, infrastructure, and national security. Think about it. In some way, Congress has probably touched your life this morning. Through representation in the House of Representatives and the Senate, it is intended to ensure that diverse regional and political perspectives contribute to policymaking. However, as we all know, challenges persist in fulfilling these democratic ideals and responsibilities. Critics argue that partisanship and legislative gridlock hinder Congress's ability to effectively meet the needs of the public, a sentiment reflected in public opinion. A recent Gallup poll found that only 4% of Americans have a great deal of trust in Congress, while 65% express little to no confidence in its ability to govern effectively. And yet, 74% of Americans, and this is across party lines, continue to support Congress's fundamental role in checking the power of the presidency, the checks and balances that we all learned in civics class when we were in elementary school that are so important. This paradox, the belief in Congress's importance paired with its frustration over its challenges, is at the heart of today's discussion. We're honored to be joined today by Senator John Cornyn, whose long career in the Senate caps 4 decades of public service and has placed him at the center of some of the most pressing debates that face our country. Moderating today's conversation is UVA's Mary Kate Cary, a seasoned political commentator and analyst, writer, documentary filmmaker, and director of Think Again at UVA. With a deep understanding of American politics, media, and governance, she has dedicated her career to fostering meaningful dialogue in democracy and civic life. A former White House speechwriter to President George H.W. Bush, Mary Kate has written extensively on bipartisanship, political communication, and civic engagement. And through Think Again, she champions free expression and viewpoint diversity on grounds here at UVA. And we're thrilled to have her join us today. And I want to thank Mary Kate personally for her friendship. But before we turn to our program, I have the privilege of introducing someone whose leadership and generosity have had a profound effect on the University of Virginia, the Karsh Institute, and on our ability to host conversations like today's. John now is a proud UVA alumnus and veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, who has served multiple terms on UVA's Board of Visitors. He's a longtime benefactor and dedicated philanthropist whose deep devotion to this institution, its history, and its future has set a standard of excellence time and time again. His support has strengthened so many facets of UVA, from the South Lawn Project and now Hall, to UVA athletics, the library, professorships, and our very own John L. Now III History and Principles of Democracy Lab at the Karsh Institute. You may have recently read about John's remarkable support for the Campaign for Graduate Excellence in the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, which will fully endow 30 graduate students, an investment in the scholars and leaders of tomorrow. And we are deeply grateful for his leadership and generosity in making the future Karsh Institute of Democracy a reality. On a personal note, I have immense appreciation for John's commitment not only to this university, but also to the broader ideals of democracy and history. In the spirit of the U.S. Marine Corps motto, John's unwavering faithfulness to both the historical and conceptual questions of democracy is evident in all he does, and those very questions provide a vital foundation to today's conversation, a thoughtful exploration of the challenges and responsibilities facing our democratic institutions. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome John now, who will now introduce today's featured guest, Senator John Cornyn.
Well, thank you, Melody, for that kind introduction. Thank you. It's always great for me to be back here on the grounds, but more importantly, to welcome United States Senator John Cornyn and his wife, Sandy, here to the grounds. I'll say something that most of you probably don't know. This is not Senator Cornyn's first trip to the grounds. As a matter of fact, he spent time here in the law school a ways back. By the crowd gathered here this morning, it's clear, Senator, that they are all very interested to hear what you have to say. I'm very fortunate to have be able to call John Cornyn a good friend for close to 40 years. He has served the people of Texas with distinction and leadership since 1985. His record, first as a district court judge, then a Texas Supreme Court judge. He became Texas Attorney General, and since 2002, one of our United States senators. He's serving his fourth term in the Senate and has just announced for his re-election campaign coming up. Committees are critical, we all know that. And the senator belongs to Finance, Judiciary, Intelligence, Foreign Relations, and importantly, the Budget Committee. He's a busy United States senator. I am now proud to introduce a great Texan, a great American leader, Senator John Cornyn. Senator, welcome.
Thank you.
So, welcome back.
Good to be back.
Go Who's. My understanding is you have an LLM from the law school.
I do. My wife and I spent 2 summers here back in '92 and '93. Professor Dan Metter, I think, initiated this program. It's for a Master's of Law degree in the judicial process. And uniquely, all of the students were sitting judges.
Wow.
And I was sitting judge on the Texas Supreme Court. But it was one of the best educational experiences I've ever had, and made me fall in love with Mr. Jefferson's University. So it's good
You're
to
in
be
the
back.
right place. That's our secret plan, is to get them all to come back here and live. So we're working on it. One thing you and I share in common is friendships with George and Barbara Bush. I miss both of them every day. And I'd love to hear how you got to know them, or Mrs. Bush in particular, I think, maybe. But tell us about George and Barbara Bush.
Well, of course, coming up in Texas politics, first through the judiciary, which I know may sound strange to talk about politics in the judiciary, but we elect judges in Texas, for better or for worse. And we keep trying to change that perhaps, but adopt some sort of plan like the Missouri plan, have retention elections, but we haven't gotten there yet. But the Bushes were the dominant political force in the Republican Party, not just in Texas, but across the nation. Of course, President Bush's distinguished record that we're all familiar with. So I got to know the family, and I guess the first time I met President H.W. Bush was in about 1987, toward the end of his term as vice president, and he was preparing to run for president. And so, but my memory, as I think I shared with you a little earlier, is primarily the one who stands out in that partnership is Barbara Bush, who was a unique personality. Just ask President H.W. Bush, or W. Bush,
yeah.
about what she was like. She was the enforcer in that family, and but she was extraordinarily generous to Sandy and me back in 1998. She was a former First Lady of the United States, and she volunteered to fly around the state of Texas in a King Air and campaign for me for Attorney General, which I could not believe it. And I still remember she had an aide with her, and I had one with me, and then Sandy was with me. Sandy wasn't the aide. It was I had a separate person. So my aide went to talk to her aide, and she said, young man, don't talk to him, talk to me. And she was just a very forceful personality, as you know, but much beloved. And of course, the Bush family has been a wonderful family and made enormous, immeasurable contributions to our country.
So as we think about him, I mean, he was a former member of Congress before he became vice president. And today we're here to talk about Congress and its role in our democracy. So I have a couple of things I want to ask you about that are sort of overarching about the institution. And then there's plenty of things in the breaking news these days that we can talk about with your perspective from the Senate. So let's jump in. And the first one is something that Melody was just referring to, which is this dichotomy between the fact that most Americans disapprove of the job Congress has been doing for the last few decades, and yet they give very high approval ratings to their own member of Congress. So they're not willing to vote anybody out about this many times, not always. How do you see that? Do you think there's a way to turn that around? What can Congress do to build more trust among the American people?
Well, I think the explanation is that it's the people they know they trust. The people they don't know, they don't trust. And so while they know they're a personal member of Congress and vote for them, presumably, maybe not unanimously, but at least the majority of the voters, they tend to have more confidence in that person. Plus, this is such a big and diverse country. And one thing I've come to appreciate is just the differences in regions of the country. For example, the constituency that I face election before, 31 million Texans, is much different from the constituency that my friend Susan Collins in Maine stands for election in front of, or Tom Tillis in North Carolina. And you could just go through all the states. And the amazing thing about Congress is it forces us to work together sometimes. But it's hard to build consensus. That's why so few people actually try. And we've had recent developments we can talk about in terms of the motivation of some people to actually run for Congress, who seem to want to become famous. They want to, what I call performance artists. They want to be, get on cable TV. They want to get the most number of clicks on social media, and they want to raise money. That's it. They don't really come to it with the idea that I'm here to solve problems and to reconcile differences and to build consensus. And again, that's hard work, which is the reason why some people seem to be positively allergic to it.
Yes. Yeah, I remember President Bush, sometimes he would answer his phone saying, doing the hard work of freedom, how can I help you? Anyway.
That's pretty good. I'm going to try that.
You can, feel free to steal that. So you have been now in the Senate since 2002.
Correct.
So 2 decades plus. How have you seen this evolution change? It sounds like it's getting harder and harder for building consensus. Why do you think that is? Do you think there's hope for turning that around in the top level?
Well, I have been there a long time now, and what I can tell you is it sort of ebbs and flows. And, you know, the trajectory is not straight, it's like this. And it depends on the mood and the views of the American people, how happy they are or unhappy they are with their government, and whether they are determined to throw the rascals out or whether they're determined to keep the rascals that they have for fear of the rascals that they don't know. And so, and then obviously the dominant personality in all of our elections is the top of the ticket, and that's the President of the United States. And I would say that, that President Trump's reemergence on the national scene has obviously been the dominant story and sort of overshadows pretty much everything else. And the truth is that over the years, Congress has delegated way too much authority to the executive branch. Part of that's intentional because Congress doesn't like to make hard decisions that will result in their not being elected in the next election that comes up, but it has consequences associated with it. And when you realize, okay, we've over-delegated, we need to recoup some of those authorities that actually are Article I authorities, it's too late because, of course, we try to pass a law today and say, and rein in some of the authorities that we've delegated to the president, like on tariffs, for example. What do you think President Trump would do with that, assuming we were able to get a bill through both houses of Congress? I don't think he would sign it. I think he'd probably veto it. So, but it's this constant dynamism in the system that is both discouraging and encouraging at the same time.
So, so when you were saying like this, where would you put us right now on that roller coaster?
This is unique in my experience. We've never had a president like President Trump before. I think part of that is a reaction to what we had before. And some of us were talking earlier at breakfast about the sense I get, and I don't think it's just me, but that the elites in the country have been doing very well, and that everybody else has basically picked up the tab. And now President Trump seems to appeal to a group of voters that haven't been politically active before, but this is their moment to come back and make sure that the government and the Congress and the presidency focus on their needs, not the needs of the elites who are making a lot of money, very comfortable, and the other folks who feel like they've been left behind are some of the working class families that have not been doing as well.
It's that old saying about it, where you stand depends on where you sit.
Yeah.
And it's for some people it's the best of times, and for some people it's the worst of times. It's really
No
quite
question.
a contrast.
I mean,
yeah.
it's not an original thought.
Right.
That our body politic is very divided, and so that makes it harder to do what I like to do the most, is to try to solve hard problems. Unfortunately, it makes it more difficult to solve hard problems. And particularly when you have within, for example, in Texas, the Republican primaries used to be dominated by what I would call Bush Republicans. That's not the case anymore. Now, in the Republican primary in Texas, President Trump has the dominant influence on the outcomes in those elections. So it's I feel like in some ways you're sort of like you're on a surfboard and you're kind of, you're surfing the waves. But it definitely has changed. But again, I don't think anything's permanent. The great thing about democracy, and we're here to talk about democracy, and you look around the world and you see what's happening in China and what's happening in Russia and these other authoritarian countries. And the great and most powerful thing about democracy is our ability to course correct, because ultimately the power comes from the people, and it's not, the government telling us what to do. Of course, that depends on the people being engaged, being aware, and being willing to make the sacrifices to participate and to insist on change. But we have the power in our hands under our system. And the question is, are people motivated to go to precinct convention meetings or county conventions or run for state Republican executive committee? Most people aren't, because it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of, you're sacrificing something else maybe you'd rather do. But those are the people who are directing our politics now, I would say on the right and on the left. It's the activists, it's the people who are showing up at these town hall meetings, the ones with the loudest voices.
Something you said earlier, one of the things we studied in the election class that we did last fall was this phenomenon called party sorting. And it used to be, I'm sure it was probably this way when you first got into the Senate, there used to be conservative Republicans, moderate, liberal, conservative Democrats, moderate, liberal. And that's how you could get big landmark legislation through, is each side could pick off people from the other side to get to the majority.
Exactly.
And the party sorting phenomenon is that has pretty much disappeared.
Well, certainly it's true in the House.
Yeah.
With the advent of computers and modern software, the ability to draw impregnable districts for incumbents has been, I think, a very big negative because and every time we do have a census every 10 years, and then we do go through redistricting and reapportionment, basically the party in power tend to consolidate their power, not to reach out. One of the most angry responses I got back in 1990 when I was chairman of the Legislative Redistricting Board in Texas, when we were redrawing, that the legislature couldn't do it, so the Legislative Redistricting Board is a constitutional board of 5 of us, including the Attorney General. We had to draw the districts, and the most angry I've ever seen some of my friends is when we drew a district that took them from a 60% majority to a 55% majority, because they said, this is sacred ground. This is my district. You can't take this away from me.
Wow.
And so fewer and fewer of these, especially congressional districts, the House districts, have become competitive. Now the states are a different issue altogether, but you've seen the evolution of some states that have become more red and some states that have become more blue. And of course, then it all boils down to the battleground states and presidential elections where the electoral vote is located, which it strikes me as particularly offensive that 6 states basically get to decide the presidential election. I guess it's 6, so that's roughly 6. And it's kind of like, well, who are we? Potted plants?
People feel like their vote doesn't count.
Right.
Yeah. There's a whole movement to switch away from the Electoral College, which would need a constitutional convention.
There is. I think the small states would not be wise to give that up.
Right. So as we talk about this phenomenon of party sorting and how to reach bipartisan consensus, I was going to ask you about some of the things that are going on in the news and which ones you think there's opportunities for movement forward in Congress, at least. And so the first one just broke basically last night. Senator Grassley, your colleague, chair of the Judiciary Committee, put out an op-ed in this morning's Wall Street Journal that said he's introducing legislation today to make sure that district court judges are not able to make nationwide injunctions and temporary restraining orders, all that sort of thing. He cited 240 Democratic lawmakers in 2023 filed an amicus brief on a case for exactly this.
Yeah.
So he believes there's bipartisan consensus on, he says, to resolve cases only between the parties before them and to make TROs immediately appealable.
Well, that was then, and this is now.
Right. Yes.
So I sometimes refer to myself as a recovering judge. I spent 13 years in the state judiciary, and so I'm acquainted with smart lawyers and lawyers who are very skillful at maximizing their advantage in a courtroom, and that's part of the skill set that lawyers have and they bring to bear for their clients. So I think one of the things that this is a symptom of the fact that because Congress is having a difficult time building consensus on things, and so much power has been delegated to the president, that you see this explosion of executive orders that invariably end up in court. And which court do they end up in? Well, they end up in a court where somebody thinks, well, I think this judge may actually be sympathetic to my argument. We used to call that venue shopping or cherry picking.
I think they still call it that.
Still do. And it exists, and it's a function of our system. There are various, well, I won't go down that rabbit hole. So Republicans used to like that during the previous administration, because you'd have a district judge in a single judge court in, let's say, Wichita Falls, Texas, who would hear a injunction case involving a national policy. And that judge would basically able to enter a temporary restraining order or an injunction, sometimes even without participation of the opposing party in the case of temporary restraining orders. So now we've come full circle, and now President Trump is concerned about these individual district judges issuing orders which basically stop the effect of his executive order. And so I think what Senator Grassley has filed, and something the Supreme Court has talked about for a number of years, is dealing with this phenomenon of nationwide injunctions. Because ordinarily, cases or controversies are what are required for a district court to have jurisdiction. But the idea that you can enter a remedy or an order that affects non-parties to the lawsuit and affects not just that district, but affects the nation is, I think, kind of an aberration that we need to look at. And there may be cases where that makes perfect sense. But in many cases, I think you could argue it does not. So we'll see whether that consensus still exists. I think now the shoe's on the other foot, there may be some reluctance to join in that effort to address nationwide injunctions. But the Supreme Court still can weigh in on that issue, and perhaps that's what it's going to require.
Any predictions whether you think Grassley's bill will get through?
I think it will not. I think it'll be a challenge.
Okay. Here's another challenging situation: is the administration's use of signal amongst the foreign policy team recently. What's your take on that? I think you've made some statements on it. And do you think this is something that Congress should act on, or the administration, or how do you think we should handle this?
Well, John now mentioned I'm on the Senate Intelligence Committee, which some people have said is an oxymoron. Mark Warner, one of the Virginia senators, is the former chairman, now the ranking member. Delightful guy, I've done a lot of great work with, but it's probably the least partisan committee in the Senate. And a part of that is because we operate behind closed doors in a secure facility. But it worries me that anybody who presumes that a commercial messaging device is secure is doing just that. They're presuming and don't really know whether it's secure or not. So I think we need to have a review. I saw Senator Wicker, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and Senator Jack Reed, who's the ranking member, have asked for an inspector general to look at that, because the consequences of an insecure communication device in sensitive matters involving national security is very dangerous. And we know our adversaries are constantly looking for ways to get access to that information. So I think we just need to know what are acceptable practices and what are not from the standpoint of national security. And of course, one thing I can guarantee, you don't want to put a journalist in your text message string.
Yeah, I think that's safe to.
That's maybe the most obvious rule.
I remember must have been '89, General Scowcroft, he had an office that faced the executive office building. He was national security advisor at the time. He would stand on his phone and face out the window and talk to people. And they told him, no, 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 there are lip readers who can see what you're saying. Turn the other way, sir.
Yeah,
And I thought, whoa.
There's technology that can pick that stuff up
So-
too. So I don't consider myself paranoid, but it's not paranoia if they really are out to get you.
Right,
So
right.
our adversaries are more than happy to collect any kind of sensitive information they can, and modern technology has made that far easier.
Way too
And it's
easy.
not just lip reading.
Yeah, yeah. So I also saw in the news this morning that Elon Musk and the Doge team is heading to the CIA this morning. And I thought I would get your take on, in the short run, what do you think he's going to do at CIA? But in general, you're on the Doge caucus in the Senate. And I'd love to hear whether you think this is an outrage or an opportunity. And because people are all over the map on
they
what
are.
Elon Musk is doing. I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, you know, it's interesting that Mr. Musk is going to the CIA, and I'm dying to know sort of what the conversation is. I don't know if it's just an information gathering exercise. I did know he went to the National Security Agency, which is our signals intelligence authority, recently, and I don't know what the conversation was there. I do know that he's involved in a bunch of important national security operations with SpaceX and other things like that. So he does have a top secret security clearance. But what I've learned in the intelligence community, it's not what your clearance is, it's because everything's compartmentalized. So it's need to know. So even though you may have the most exquisite security clearance in the world, but if you don't need to know, you're not going to find out. So I don't know what that is. It may be just sort of a public relations thing that the director is doing just to show that he's welcoming. But again, you know, the problem with the controversy over Mr. Musk, I personally think some of the stuff that he and the Department of Government Efficiency have uncovered have been outrageous and egregious expenditures and wastes of taxpayer dollars. In a more sane environment, I think, in a less divisive environment and where we weren't as polarized, it's like USAID, the foreign aid. One of the best programs in the USAID has been the PEPFAR program. I still remember Jimmy Carter at George W. Bush's, at his institute at SMU, and crediting President George W. Bush for saving millions of lives.
Yeah.
But when you start looking at the program USAID, it takes time to work to differentiate between the good expenditures of taxpayer money and the bad expenditures. And so there's necessarily going to be some disruption and delay, which are causing a lot of people angst. And I think initially it wasn't clear whether Mr. Musk was making personnel or financial decisions alone. Now it's clear that he is basically an advisor and that those decisions are being made by the department heads, the cabinet members, and the president, which is where that responsibility should lie. But we're going to have a big fight, presumably up in the Supreme Court of the United States on anti-impoundment, because President Trump is testing the limits of the executive branch's ability to withhold funding that's been appropriated by Congress. One way we know we can cut that funding is for the White House to send a rescissions package to the Congress, and we can pass that with a majority vote in both houses and eliminate that funding. But the courts are going to be really key in a lot of the line drawing in terms of what the extent of executive power really are. And those are not going to be decided at the district court level or even the mid-level appellate courts. They're going to be decided ultimately by the Supreme Court.
Do you think there's a role for the legislature to decide that so it doesn't necessarily go to the courts? Do you see Congress reacting to these executive orders?
Well,
some
of
way?
course there is. I mean, theoretically, we could do anything we want to do, but there's so many divergent interests. Part of the challenge we have with regard to the $36.4 trillion national debt is that typically when you have an appropriations process each year, one side says we need to beef up defense spending. And the other side, well, if you're going to beef up defense spending, we're going to need parity on non-defense discretionary spending. And so there's no real incentive to keep the number down. And now we're spending more money on interest on the national debt than we are on defense, which is an unsustainable state of affairs. So I think as radical as it may seem and unconventional as it may seem, I'm hopeful that actually something good comes out of this DOGE process, but I understand how controversial it is and how much Mr. Musk has become a target.
It's quite controversial, I agree. And one of the things that we saw recently along these same lines is this continuing resolution and these, for the millionth time, are we going to shut down the government? And so on the budget committee and finance part of your job portfolio, do you see us ever getting back to regular order and get away from these omnibus spending bills? Because I think that's part of what's happening with all the DOGE stuff is that's where they're getting in all this spending.
You're exactly right. But I'm going to tell you a secret
Oh, here we go.
that most members of Congress aren't really aware of and that most people don't talk about, which is really important. So the money that Congress appropriates on an annual basis is only 28% of the money that the federal government spends. The rest of it's spent through the tax code, so-called tax expenditures, and the other part of it is mandatory spending programs. We create the program, somebody qualifies for it, the most well-known of which are Social Security and Medicare,
Sure.
but we spend about $700 billion a year in non-Medicare, non-Social Security mandatory spending, programs we turn on. They aren't capped, they're not indexed to inflation, and they grow at 6, 7, 8% a year. That's really where the debt is accumulating the most. But we need to look at all of that. And my hope is that as part of the current budget process and the reconciliation process that flows from that, we will be able to do that. We'll be able to begin to chip away at some of the debt curve.
Hallelujah.
And identify things that maybe we agree are bad ways to spend taxpayer dollars.
You think we'll get back to regular order?
It's hard. I don't, in a body that operates on unanimous consent, which is what the Senate does. In the absence of unanimous consent, it takes 60 votes to do almost anything. That's why the budget process is so important, because it's a unique carve-out or exception to that rule. If it's a budget process under the 1974 Budget Act, you can do it with a majority vote in both houses and a presidential signature. That's why when you have, as we currently do, both houses and the presidency held by the same party, that's when you see this action. So I think that's one of the hardest and most controversial and unknowable topics. I asked Bob Gates, former SecDef for several different presidents, and a wonderful human being and a great patriot. I asked him one time a few years ago, I said, what's the single most important thing we can do for national security? And he said, no more continuing resolutions.
Wow.
What do we do every year? More continuing resolutions.
Wow.
And because you can't do new starts with a continuing resolution, and it's also very hard to plan. Our defense industrial base needs to be rebuilt, and it's real hard to get private contractors to agree to invest billions of dollars in an industrial base when they don't know whether they're going to get paid from year to year. So it's a huge, huge challenge.
So in a few minutes, we're going to open this to questions. And the way we're going to do it is in a minute or so, there'll be there it is, QR code, and you can submit your question. over your phone. Very high tech here in the Dome Room. So feel free to start thinking of questions. I've got another one for you, sort of breaking news. There was talk in the last couple days about merging DEA and ATF. And I know you are chairman of the Senate Drug Caucus. And I am a former speechwriter for several of the DEA administrators. I think there is bipartisan consensus, feel free to disagree with me, that we need to do something about the fentanyl crisis in this country. And so the question is, what can the Senate Drug Caucus do that the agencies can't? Is there room for institutional overlap here? And what can we do to help this scourge of fentanyl?
Well, I think the single most, fentanyl, by the way, synthetic opioids are the single largest killer of people between the age of 18 and 45 years old now. And if you go to Colombia, for example, where cocaine is famously refined from the coca plant, or you go to Mexico where heroin is made from the poppies that grow in Mexico, in synthetic opioids, by contrast, are just chemicals being mixed up. And most of the chemicals, the so-called precursor chemicals, come from China or India. And they're dual use. In other words, there's a legitimate use for some of the chemicals, but they can also be co-opted or used for fentanyl production. And then, of course, they're made into pill presses that look like conventional pharmaceuticals. And it's sad to see families grieving over their youngster who thought they were just taking an innocuous Percocet or Xanax or something like that. Not that we want them taking anything, but they didn't think it would kill them. So the single biggest challenge we have is, in a Texas senator with 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico, I always say, as I told President Lopez Obrador a few years ago, I said, Mr. President, I said, the United States and Mexico are like an old married couple. We can't get divorced. We need to make the marriage work. I know there's some people who think we can divorce ourselves from Mexico, and for better or for worse, we cannot. I mean, we have a huge economic investment in binational trade that supports a lot of jobs in the United States, and including my state. But to your point, one of the biggest challenges we have is getting cooperation from the government of Mexico. Believe it or not, they're a little sensitive about their sovereignty. After the United States took about half of their landmass back in 1836.
By the way, are you upset about the Gulf of America versus Gulf of Mexico?
I can go with that.
Go with either one?
I can go either way.
Either way?
I'm not gonna fight every battle. So, but trying to figure out, and I'm gonna be going to Mexico City in April this next month to visit and try to figure out, are there more ways we can cooperate with the Mexican government? They don't want an American face or name on anything, but they will cooperate to some extent. But corruption is epidemic in the country because the cartels are just so powerful. There's an expression called plato o plomo. It's silver or lead. That's what the cartels tell people who won't cooperate. You take our money, or we'll kill you and your family, and with unfortunate but predictable consequences.
Wow. How do you feel about DEA and ATF merging? You think that's a good idea or a bad idea?
I think, what I'd be interested in is I don't think merging for merging's sake, but if there's efficiencies to be gained, I think there needs to be, of course, in Washington, D.C., what tends to happen, and we saw this even post 9/11, is instead of going in and reforming institutions, you create another layer of bureaucracy on top. We did that with the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, post 9/11 because of concerns there. So, and then you have a proliferation of specialty federal law enforcement agencies like the ATF and DEA and others. And I just think we need a more thorough analysis. Okay, what is it you're trying to get at? What are they actually able to accomplish, and what else needs to be done? Which means I'd love to talk to Asa Hutchison and some of the other people who were head of the DEA. Of course, they tend to be, these stovepipes, people tend to be very protective of them. And so But I think that's something worth doing.
Good. Yeah, I feel like there's a reason you got the Hero of the Taxpayer Award a few years ago. I think your sense of how much waste there is and can we streamline this? 37 trillion in debt is not sustainable for the
No.
next generation, and that's
Well, Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff 10 years ago, said the biggest single threat to our national security is our debt.
yeah.
And when he said that, I thought, that's kind of a weird thing to say, but it's actually become true because we spend about 2.8% of our GDP on defense. And even in Europe, in NATO now, the minimum is 2%, and President Trump has asked them to get to 5%, so
Yep.
they carry more of the financial burden. So we need to spend more on defense, but more, just as importantly as that, is how we spend the money. And I'm hoping that we can see some shakeups in the Pentagon with some of the new personnel and some of the new administration to try to figure out how can we sort of get back to basics, which is ultimately the goal is to reestablish deterrence. We don't want to fight any fights we don't have to fight, and the best way to do that is, as Ronald Reagan said, peace through strength. And right now, it's the most dangerous world I've seen
Wow.
since World War II.
That's quite a statement coming from you. Wow. Are we ready for a few questions? If not, I have plenty more. Okay, go ahead.
Senator Cornyn, thank you so much for being here. My name is Carly, and I'm an intern here at the Karsh Institute, as well as a fourth year at UVA. You recently ran for the position of Senate Majority Leader against John Thune and Rick Scott.
Thanks for bringing that up.
What is it like to jockey for and run for leadership within Congress?
Well, as you've heard, I've been in the Senate a long time, and I've held a lot of leadership positions within the Republican conference, and felt like this is something I had prepared to do. But unfortunately, as I tell my friends, I lost by a field goal in the Super Bowl. But the good news is John Thune is a good friend and a very good senator, and I'm happy to support him, and I want him and our Republican conference to be successful. I want President Trump to be successful. And so we are working together. Obviously, he comes from a small state. I come from a big state. Our interests as individual senators don't necessarily always overlap. But again, part of the challenge and part of the fun of being in the Senate is trying to reconcile those differences and get to a consensus. Again, quoting Ronald Reagan, he liked to say, and this sort of fallen out of fashion these days, but he liked to say, what do you call somebody who you agree with 8 times out of 10? He said, I call him a friend and an ally, not a 20% traitor. It seems like today we're focusing more on the differences rather than on what we can accomplish. But we're doing good, and but the proof is going to be in what we were able to accomplish this year. Thank you.
You mentioned the Senate Intelligence Committee is one of the least polarized, largely because their work happens behind closed doors. How do you think Congress can do a better job at showing the common ground and the works against polarization that they are doing to raise appreciation of Congress in general?
Well, I think it really depends on the individual personalities. And by that, I mean this. For example, I mentioned Mark Warner, the senator from Virginia, back post-COVID, when I began to appreciate the vulnerability that the United States had because of supply chains. The idea of globalization was we're going to make things in the cheapest place in the world to make them, and then we're going to import them into the United States. Because I remember talking to my governor after COVID hit, and I said, Governor, what do you need? And he said, well, I need testing. He need more testing kits, and I need PPE. And I said, great, what's PPE? He said, personal protective equipment. We don't make any in America anymore. It's all made in China. Well, that started to make me think about other things we are vulnerable on, and one of them was advanced semiconductors. So I worked together with Mark Warner to introduce a bill in 2020, June, I think it was, called the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS and Science Act is what it ultimately became, to incentivize more investment in the United States in manufacturing of advanced semiconductors. And we're seeing already the results of that. Taiwan Semiconductor, a huge facility outside of Phoenix, but also in places like Central Texas, where Samsung is spending about $80 billion to build advanced semiconductor manufacturing. So those sorts of things, maybe they don't get a lot of attention, but are, I think, are important. I think that may be one of the most significant things that I've been involved in recently, to be sure, because if you think about another pandemic, or let's say a natural disaster, or let's say President Xi decides to pull the trigger on Taiwan, and there's a disruption in those supply chains from Asia, we would be up a creek without a paddle, to be sure. It would cause an immediate depression, and we wouldn't be able to get access to the advanced semiconductors we need to do everything from operate your cell phone to run the avionics on an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter.
On the topic of common ground, with all the congressional infighting we hear about from Congress, why was the Farm Bill such a success?
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Why was the Farm Bill such a success, given all the infighting?
The Farm Bill. Well, we're supposed to pass a Farm Bill every 5 years, and that's one thing we're a little overdue on. That's another example of when we can't get things done. We have to sort of kick the can down the road. But the Farm Bill is an interesting creature, because as one of my colleagues, Senator Bozeman, who's the chairman of the Ag Committee, he says, let's put the farm back in the Farm Bill. And by that, he means that only about 20% of the money we spend on the Farm Bill actually goes to farmers and agricultural producers. 80% of it is in so-called nutrition programs like SNAP, that used to be called food stamps, or the Women and Children nutrition programs. And so, and now with sort of, you made me think about this, but with the new Secretary of Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, talking about Make America Healthy Again, we find ourselves in this bizarre situation where we subsidize through your tax dollars people buying what I would consider to be not the healthiest food, sugary drinks and snack foods. And of course, Americans are famously overweight. And now we're actually having discussions about how can we make GLP-1 drugs, subsidize those so more people can lose weight using those weight loss drugs. So we potentially could be subsidizing both ends of that spectrum, which again is crazy. Just almost, you can't make this stuff up. Yeah. But so the Farm Bill will be a big issue. That's really where you see a lot of regional differences, because in Texas, cotton is a big important crop. We obviously raise a lot of cattle and have a lot of livestock, but other places have so-called specialty crops and have different interests. So that's really one of the most unique areas where we have to sort of reconcile these regional differences.
And as our final question, we have a special guest who also has a question.
Oh, good.
What was your role model when you were younger?
My role model?
Yeah. Good question.
Well, I know this sounds very personal, but it was my father. My dad was a career Air Force officer. He served in the Army Air Corps in World War II. He survived 25 missions over Germany as part of the Army Air Corps in a B-17 and was shot down on his 26th mission and was a POW, a prisoner of war, the last few months of World War II. And he, like so much of the people of his generation, came back to America as part of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. He went to school on the GI Bill. He went to a community college in Corpus Christi, Texas, and then went to, back in the day, you didn't need to get a 4-year degree to get into dental school. So he
Wow.
decided after being shot down and being a POW to become a dentist, which I guess he didn't want any more of the craziness associated with what he had previously been through. But he was a great role model for me. I think just among public figures, should I mention Thomas Jefferson?
You're in the right place.
I'm here at UVA. Obviously, he was a seminal figure in American history and an inspiration to our democracy and the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. I'm a big Abraham Lincoln fan because he saved the Union. But I guess I could go down the list, but those are just some thoughts. Thanks for the question.
So, so we are apparently out of time. My last question, I will now skip since we're running short on time, was going to be, what is making you hopeful? But I think I can speak on behalf of many people here that you are making us hopeful, and your sense of service, clearly from your father's example, and your commitment to our nation, a lifelong of public service. I really can't say thank you enough for everything you've done and for everything hopefully you're going to keep doing. And please come back more. We love having you here. And go Who's. So thank you again. Thank you.